All right, we are back with a new video and continuing with this series of MLP season episode rankings. Today I'll be doing season 8, and I don't think many people disagree when I say that season 8 is the worst season of the show, as it's not as if there aren't great episodes from this season, as we'll get into later on. It's just that there is such a pretty big tier of mediocrity, as we'll definitely dig into once this video gets started. And it's sort of interesting just how many episodes I would consider bottom tier from this season, as well as how many episodes I would consider to be quite bad, all things considered, or at least very deeply flawed. So a lot of this video will come off as a bit negative, I'm not going to lie. However, it will eventually get better, and there are good episodes to break down with this season, but we'll just have to get there as we get there. But there are 24 episodes to rank from this season, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 24, and I know that with this season at least, there were quite a few candidates for which one is the worst, as there are quite a few stinkers that we'll be discussing in the section of the video. It's just a matter of figuring out which one was the worst. And I narrowed it down to 2 episodes in particular. I feel like there are 2 episodes that are particularly abhorrent, in my opinion. And even within those 2, there was quite a bit of debate over which one I should have at the bottom, as I consider these 2 episodes to be very frustrating for me, and to talk about them as one of the worst episodes, not just of the season, but really of the whole series. However, I feel like these episodes are frustrating in different ways, where one episode is more frustrating on its own, and actually I feel like that episode is a bit more frustrating and harder to watch than the other one, while the other one is one that is more frustrating in context to the rest of the series. And when you see that episode, when I see that episode, I think that it is pretty bad in the grand scheme of things. And I feel like on the whole, that episode does a bit more harm in the grand scheme of things to the series, whereas the other episode is a bit more consistent with what I would expect from certain things, which will make more sense when I get to that episode. So for this list, I decided to go with the episode that was worse in the grand scheme of things, rather than the episode that was more bad on its own. And here at 24, we have Yakity Sax. Now, I know there are people who will disagree with this take as being the worst episode, as it isn't really the worst episode to watch per se. I mean, in a vacuum, it's just a largely boring and broken episode. And heck, even if it was a season 1 episode and they had a story like this, it wouldn't be the worst episode of the season per se. I mean, it still wouldn't be good, but it wouldn't be as bad as it is. I mean, to get right into the flaws, I mean, the story is essentially broken to where we see Pinky suddenly pick up this interest in playing the Vitaphone, which isn't the worst premise in the world, as we see Pinky really feel connected to the Yak culture through her previous experiences with them. It's very clear that she's developed a good relationship with them, and it's clear from this that this was probably some fun activity that she picked up from being around them, to the point where she probably starts to get this interest. And, you know, from there, we obviously see her be pretty bad at it, to the point where she's playing it out in public and having a very real and detrimental effect on her friends' lives. I mean, she upsets all of Fluttershy's animals to where she's up all night trying to calm them down. She costs Rainbow Dash a race, and she turns all of the apples into Sweet Apple Acres into applesauce when it isn't even saucing season. So we see that her playing it, the way that she's going about it, is very real and it's very negative, and it's clearly a problem that the main 6 definitely have justification for trying to address. And you would think that they would tell her to maybe get some lessons, or if not, to not get lessons, at least play in a spot where she isn't going to turn all the apples into applesauce or cause all this disruption. Basically just show them some common courtesy. I mean, this problem has a very easy solution, but yet Twilight decides to go straight for the jugular and say that Pinky is bad at the Uvitophone and that she shouldn't play it at all, which is completely out of left field and really just feels like something designed to make this conflict much bigger than it really had any business being. And from there, we see Pinky fall into the suppression. They try everything in their power to make her feel better until she runs away to live in Yakakistan in misery. They go to Yakakistan, tell her that she should just be happy playing the Uvitophone, which probably should have been what they said from the start. And then problem solved, I guess. So on the surface, I mean, obviously the story is broken. Again, it seems to ignore the fact that there was a very real problem with how Pinky was playing the Uvitophone. It wasn't so much that she was bad at it, it was that she was playing it in settings where it was having a very real disruption on her friends' lives. And there was a very easy middle ground that they could have gone there instead of telling Pinky to just not play anymore and that she's bad. So there's that to consider. And I haven't even mentioned how this episode had a missed opportunity with Yona, how a literal yak who lives in Ponyville now, how she could have had a role in this episode. Instead of Pinky having to run away to Yakakistan, Yona definitely could have played a role in that episode. I mean, that's more so a missed opportunity than a knock against the episode. But again, I mean, if we look at the episode in a vacuum, it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's still pretty bad, like I said, but it's not the reason that this episode is the worst. The reason this episode is the worst, and the reason it's here at number 24, is because it completely trivializes all of Pinky's character development and everything that makes Pinky interesting as a character, in my opinion. Where we see from previous seasons that Pinky has a lot of depth to her as a character, that she's someone that cares a lot about seeking the approval of other ponies, and she gets very upset when she doesn't get that approval or she feels like her friends are abandoning her. And in turn, her throwing parties is a weird, almost cruel kind of way of her seeking acceptance, to where it's literally her life's purpose to throw parties because that's the thing that she cares about. And she does it to make others happy. And if she fails to do that, then that very realistically triggers an identity crisis within her. And all that stuff is very interesting. And I'm glad that we had episodes across the earlier seasons that got to explore that and give Pinky some character development. I mean, and I feel like episodes like Pinky Pride and Party Poot were great ways of sort of culminating a lot of that character arc, with Pinky sort of accepting herself for who she is. And it was all very good. And we see that through episodes like that. However, this episode basically takes that and makes it very trivial, to where Pinky, after going through all this character development, is now at the point where she is very easily willing to lose her self-esteem, per se, over something that's very minor, in the way that she completely loses her will to live over something as minor as being told that she's bad at playing a musical instrument that she only picked up a week ago, in spite of all this character development that she's gone through, in spite of other episodes dealing with this in a much more significant way, in a way that really gets more to the core of what it is that Pinky cares about and things that would more realistically cause her to fall into a situation like this, and her having development and moving past a lot of those issues, only to fall into a comically deep and unbreakable depression over something so minor. I don't know. I mean, and I understand if people will disagree with my take here, but I feel like this episode is just really bad in that regard for me. And that's a pill that's really hard for me to swallow when it comes to processing this episode. I mean, it's not just that the episode is bad on its own and really boring to watch, honestly. It's the fact that it cuts so much against the grain. It's the fact that it really trivializes a character that I grew to care about so much, and a character who is already subject to be seen as comic relief and already subject to not be taken as seriously. And honestly, to the point where people make jokes and memes about her, like turning into Pinkamena for whatever reason. I feel like this episode just doesn't do any favors to Pinky as a character. And really, in context, when you consider everything that she's gone through before, it just makes it all the more worse, in my personal opinion. So I understand if people disagree with my take here, and admittedly, it's not the worst episode to watch. However, it's that bigger context and how this episode fits into Pinky's character arc over the course of the series that makes this the worst episode of season 8 for me. And it's because of that it's here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we have the more frustrating episode to watch, the one that I alluded to earlier, and here we have A Matter of Principles. And as I said, I feel like this episode is worse on its own, despite it not being the worst in context, as we've seen Discord act somewhat similarly to this in the past, with him trying to teach lessons, even though he's not the most upstanding character in the world, him just being frustrating and obtuse. I mean, all that isn't particularly new per se. However, it's in this episode that it's really at its highest level here, with Discord literally going out of his way to teach Starlight this lesson purely out of spite, to where he wants to be helpful in running the school. Starlight refuses, as she feels like she can handle it on her own, and he basically spends the episode proving to Starlight why he is precisely unfit for the job. I mean, he causes trouble, he is a disruptive student, he puts a lot of the other students into harm's way. He calls Starlight an incompetent, power-hungry unicorn at one point, a comment that probably really hurt her on a deep and personal level, and not to mention that he facilitated all this stuff by sending the main six on a mission and putting them into direct danger, including Fluttershy, someone that he has grown to care about. He just allows her to go into harm's way for no other reason than to put Starlight into a position to where she could name him the substitute head mayor, but doesn't, and causes all this conflict to begin with. Discord is really unlikable here, and this episode is basically all the problems that I have with him, just amplified to 11 basically. And yet, despite everything I just mentioned, we're supposed to believe that Starlight is the one in the wrong here for not listening to Discord, and how she should have taken his concerns more seriously, even though everything I just mentioned proves why he is unfit to be in that position of power. And I feel like the fact that the episode doesn't do more to recognize that is a pretty big problem. Now, to be fair, it does try to acknowledge those problems to a degree, like you do get the occasional comment from Spike about how that's just who Discord is, but it doesn't take away from how insufferable he is throughout a lot of this episode, and none of it is funny or endearing or anything. It's just annoying from beginning to end, and I really come away from this episode with nothing. I mean, it has a broken message, of Starlight basically being forced to accept Discord's help, even though he wasn't very helpful for a lot of it. And in general, the story was just not very fruitful. We didn't really have anything of value to offer, and all it did was make me annoyed and frustrated throughout a lot of it. So all those factors is a big reason that this episode is as bad as it is. And as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, I feel like it is a worse episode in a vacuum than Yakity Sax, to the point where I did consider putting it below Yakity Sax. However, considering the fact that it doesn't really cut as much against what Discord has demonstrated in previous episodes, and a spoiler episodes that he does afterwards, as well as the fact that at the end of the day, the episode shows a little bit of self-awareness over how annoying Discord is, those were just enough merits to have it above Yakity Sax, but it is still a terrible episode, not an episode I would rewatch per se, unless it's for a video like this, and because of that, it is here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and I feel like there is a bit of a gap between this episode and the previous two we just talked about. I mean, this episode is still really bad, especially considering that happens in season 8, to where it probably would have been slightly better had it been a season 1 or 2 episode, but it's the fact that it's a season 8 episode that really drags it down. But here we have the end in Friend, and really this was just a worthless episode in my opinion. Really highlights the fact that the writers probably didn't have that many ideas during season 8, and they really just tried to rehash something that probably would have worked better in season 1, where we see Rainbow Dash and Rarity come to the realization that they don't have that much in common, which I know, huge shocker. But yet, instead of recognizing this from earlier on or trying to see all the good that they did and all the bonding that they did through saving Equestria multiple times, they literally just resort to petty arguing, and a lot of it is just really tedious. I mean, we see them trying to do some activity only for one of them to get completely sidetracked and the other to get really annoyed by them. I mean, we have their arguing in front of Starlight and Starlight trying to be a mediator there by having them read a book, only for Rarity to not even read the book and for the arguing to just continue. And then we have their journey that Twilight sends them on, which was very obviously just a fake mission designed to help them recognize what they probably should have already known, in that they have more in common than this more superficial stuff that they spend the episode bickering about, and through that they learn to become friends again. Again, if this were a season 1 episode, which at that point in the series, it clearly was established that the main 6 weren't as solidified as a group, maybe they didn't know each other as well, then this could have worked a little bit better. I mean, heck, we have Look Before You Sleep, which was a very similar plot involving Rarity and Applejack. And that episode, I mean, while it wasn't good, was at least better because it happened early on in the series when the characters hadn't gone through as much to each other. I mean, we have reason to believe that before, like the series began, that they probably didn't spend that much time together given their different backgrounds. And it's just through them getting used to each other more that causes a lot of their differences to be highlighted and for them to have less common ground to base their friendship on. But here, like, the episode literally falls apart because it happens in season 8. After they spend so much time together, after they long should have recognized that A, they have different interests, and that B, those differences don't matter as much because they have spent so much time together that they have had time to build up some common interests and a deep bond that goes beyond those petty things. But yet, they still allow those differences to get in the way of their friendship. And again, if this were a season 1 episode, it would have been a little bit more excusable, but it's the fact that happens in season 8, and even outside of that, the episode itself just isn't very funny or really enjoyable to watch. I mean, a lot of it is just Rarity and Rainbow Dash bickering. That leads me to have this episode here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and we have a very similar episode to The End and Friend, but is slightly more interesting, but even in it's not that much more interesting. And here we have non-compete clause, and similar to The End and Friend, this is an episode that straight up doesn't really work in season 8, as these characters have already gone through so much together. And even more egregiously than The End and Friend is that Applejack and Rainbow have already learned a lesson in competition, particularly in Fall Weather Friends. There was literally a season 1 episode that was very similar to this one, where they learn a similar lesson, and yet here they are sort of back at it again. Only this time, it's even less excusable because now they're teachers at a school, and that now their actions have a direct and negative effect on their students, where they care so much about winning this Teacher of the Month award that they literally resort to putting their friends in danger, with Yona almost drowning at one point, just so that they can win this award. And it was just like, really, are we really going to be doing this in season 8? And that's just it with this episode. I mean, aside from that, there's slightly more going on. I mean, some of the gags are kind of funny. Like, I kind of like how Fluttershy always makes the same face in all of her Teacher of the Month pictures. And the story isn't as broken per se, but it's the fact that we shouldn't even be having this episode in season 8. And really, this episode was born out of desperation, it feels like, where I can't have it too high, and it is here number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we got another stinker right here. And this one was a bit more on the frustrating end compared to the previous 2 we just talked about. However, this episode at least has more of a reason to exist than The End and Friend or Non-Compete Clause, even though it's still not good. And here we have the breakup breakdown. And this episode was very tedious to watch. I mean, it is so apparent just how they were able to make this conflict last as long as possible. the fact that Big Mac walks in on Sugar Belle and Mrs. Cake right as Sugar Belle is trying to make this big deal out of the fact that she's moving the Ponyville, like her saying that we need to talk, and how Big Mac just happens to miss all the other context, which leads him to believe that she's about to break up with him, is very annoying, especially in the rewatch. Like, and even when you're watching it the first time, I mean, it's so obvious that she's not actually going to break up with him, that this is all just some big misunderstanding. And yet, so much of the episode is just waiting for that misunderstanding to really blow up in Big Mac's face and for it all to be cleared up. And even the side plot, it relies on a very similar mechanic, only in that case, the misunderstanding is even more egregious because you know that the package that the CMC get was clearly supposed to be Big Mac's gift to Sugar Belle, and they spend the whole episode trying to wonder who their suitor is, even though we clearly know that the cake wasn't for them. And the only reason it was because the writing got smudged. Again, very contrived stuff there. I mean, we have the scene where Big Mac tries to beat Sugar Belle to the punch by breaking up with her, and it all just going really poorly. Now, granted, it is kind of funny, like when Big Mac is using Discord's advice of leaning, and like Sugar Belle's like, "Why are you leaning like that?" And Big Mac's like, "I don't know." So, I mean, at least there's that. And Mrs. Cake does have a joke at one point saying, "Oh, dearie, you shouldn't say we need to talk because he's going to think you're breaking up with him." So it does show a little bit of self-awareness in that regard. And I feel like the main thing that redeems this episode from being even lower on the list is some of the stuff with Discord and Spike. I mean, I like the scene where Discord takes them into the Ogres and Oubliettes game and tries to hook Big Mac up with one of the characters in that. I found that scene to be slightly amusing, so that was at least a bit of amusement there. And plus the scene where Sugar Belle is trying to leave town and she, like, her wagon breaks down and she's like, "Oh, of all the rotten luck." I mean, even though it's supposed to be a pretty heartfelt scene, I mean, I just found that kind of funny with Sugar Belle just being such stick in the mud about all this. So there are a couple moments in this episode that give me slight amusement, but it's still the fact that the episode is so telegraphed, especially in the rewatch. There really is no real rewatch value for this, especially and even on the first time, like where you know like that this is all some big misunderstanding. It just makes this episode a chore to get through because you know that they're gonna eventually find out the truth and that this was all a massive waste of time. And that's what this episode is. I mean, even with those moments, this episode is a waste of time, and I don't really care too much about it on the offset. However, it does at least advance Big Mac and Sugar Belle's relationship to a degree. I mean, at least it's not a rehash of something, and at least it advances something that we probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But still, this is such a drag of an episode that I have to leave it here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and we have an episode that is pretty widely disliked and compared to an episode that I talked about in a previous video, in the sense that it handles a pretty serious subject matter particularly poorly. And I feel like that is largely the case with this episode, but we'll get more into that in a moment. But number 19, we have a Rockhoof and a Hard Place. And as I said, this episode does deal with a serious issue, that being suicide, in a less than ideal way. And this episode gets compared a lot to Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep, and that episode also dealt with some mental health issues. And I talked about in that video how I felt like, yes, there were issues with the setup for Luna's self-hatred and her self-harm, and I felt like the resolution was a bit rushed there. However, I feel like it wasn't the worst concept in the world, and I felt like it at least gave it its due in that regard. However, with this episode, I feel like they were a bit more clueless when it came to how they handle Rockhoof's struggling to deal with the modern world and him wanting to be petrified, which is supposed to be treated as the equivalent of suicide. However, I feel like this episode was a lot less aware about that analogy between Rockhoof being turned into stone and him wanting to commit suicide. And it almost felt like it was like he was hand waving it to a degree, where he said he was going to do it. Then he was spending some time like posing, trying to figure out what pose he wants his statue to be in. Then they get called for him to tell a story and really highlight his value and him being a storyteller. Then the story ends and he's like, "Well, I guess it's time to go." but then resolved the issue soon after. So I feel like the episode does a much worse job in terms of discussing its particular issue than I feel like it does with Do Princess Dream of Magic Sheep. And outside of that, I feel like the episode just isn't too interesting. I mean, a lot of it is Rockhoof trying out different jobs but screwing up. I mean, and while it is supposed to be serious in some regards, I couldn't help but laugh at certain moments, like the fact that Spike and Smolder just happened to have a fire breathing contest indoors on a regular basis, and how that was the reason why Rockhoof was an idiot for trying to put out the fire there. There's also the sailing scene where he's trying to be a sailor with the hippogriffs, and the way in which the captain dismisses him after he screws up. Like, he gives his really like ridiculous salute about how he is a worthy person, but it's just that their lives just weren't meant to cross or whatever. I found that scene to be pretty ridiculous as well. So there's at least that, and I feel like those are just some minor moments of amusement, even though I do find them a bit ironic amusement. So there's that. But this episode, again, is boring for a lot of it. I mean, a lot of it is just Raku screwing up, which isn't the most interesting thing in the world. And even when it comes to handling its subject matter of suicide, I feel like the episode just doesn't give it the weight that it probably should have gotten. And it's because of that this episode does fall here to number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we are still in the bottom tier. I mean, this is not good. And this episode is a bit bizarre for me. And here we have Fake It Till You Make It. And this episode probably has the weirdest premise in the entire series, where the whole shtick is Fluttershy is put in charge of running Rarity's shop, but she struggles with stage fright as she sort of views social interaction as being like a performance. So in order to get around that, she decides to create all these characters so that she can perform to the customers. And it's through the characters being mean that causes problems to ensue. Now, it's not in something that I completely find weird, as I know there are actors in real life who struggle a lot with social interaction and definitely use their characters to mask that to some degree. I mean, I know from my personal experience that I did theater in high school, and I know that I was a lot more confident on the stage than I was when just talking to random people. Now, mind you, I was following a script for that, while Fluttershy was basically just doing impressions. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but I can at least see where they got this idea to a degree. But it is still such a weird premise considering this episode. And I know people will say that this episode is contributing to the idea that Fluttershy never grows. I mean, as at this point in the series, Fluttershy should be pretty confident with, you know, like performance. And in fact, there's another episode on this list that we'll be talking about soon where she's literally performing on stage. So, you know, take that as you will. But we see through a lot of the episode that Fluttershy is just creating problems with her different characters. And it's only at the end where Rarity and the others allow Fluttershy to take off the mask and really just be herself that allows her to solve this problem. But at the end of the day, this is such a weird premise for me. I mean, I will say that I do at least like some of the characters. I mean, even though they're a bit on the zany side, I mean, you have the hipster, you have the goth, and you have the prissy boots. I'll call her that. So, you know, there was some gags to be had there, but it is such a weird premise, and I still wonder why this episode even exists. And I feel like outside of that, I mean, it's not the most funny in the world. I mean, the message is just okay, I guess, but it is just so weird for me that I can't have it too much higher. And it is here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17. And if this episode were on any other season, there's no way it is this high in the list. But given that this is season 8, I mean, it kind of falls here. But here we have Father Knows Beast. And I know there are plenty of people who really despise this episode. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it's still a deeply flawed episode, as Sludge is a pretty reprehensible character throughout. Doesn't really offer anything of value. It doesn't really have any redeeming qualities to him. And it's really bizarre, like, why he resorts to this lie of telling Spike that he's his father just so that he can live in this castle and partake in all the pleasures of pony life and really just take advantage of him throughout. So I feel like that alone is a bit mean spirited and probably something that doesn't really help the episode too much. I mean, the song itself isn't too great either, although it does have a couple funny lyrics. And we also obviously have the scene that I remember the most from it, where Spike literally says something so hurtful to Twilight that it breaks her heart, which still remains one of the most bizarre moments in the entire series. I have no idea what they were going for there, where it was supposed to be like this emotional scene, but it almost feels kind of funny with how crazy that gag is. Like, why? But similar to how I talked about this episode in the past, there are some redeeming qualities to it. I do like the interactions with Smolder. I do like the confrontation at the end when Smolder and Spike confront Sludge and really get him to spill the beans about him actually not being Spike's father. So at least there's that going for it. And again, even the X-ray scene, while it is bizarre and really messes around with the tone of the scene, it is something I at least remember and something that I like to reference a lot. So at least there's that going for it. However, this is still not a good episode by any means. And as I said, I feel like on any other season, this episode would definitely be lower here. But it's just through there being obviously worse episodes that have less redeeming qualities than this one that causes this one to be a bit higher on the list, and it is here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and this episode isn't that bad, if I'm being perfectly honest. However, it is still not too funny, but here we have the Mod couple. And the thing about this episode is Pinky doesn't see the irony in her thinking that Mudbriar is really boring and really annoying and just insufferable to deal with, despite the fact that Maud, at least on the outside, comes off in a very similar fashion. Which, I mean, considering how much I like Maud as a character, I mean, we obviously know that Maud has quite a bit going on. And considering what we know about Maud, there's a good chance that Mudbriar also has a level of depth to him, particularly with him growing to care so much about Styx and him growing to care a lot about Maud, and the way that Maud reacts to him is clearly indicating how the two of them are clearly meant for each other. And yet Pinky just basically treats Mudbriar like how a lot of her friends treated Maud in Maud Pie, which isn't really funny per se. It's just kind of whatever, in my personal opinion. And that's really the main joke for a lot of this episode. And the fact that it's not even that funny of a joke just causes a lot of the humor here to fall flat. I mean, probably the most memorable moment for me is when Pinky is crying on the bridge and she's wondering what's going on. And she has all these visions of her friends saying how they are different from what she thought they were. Like Applejack doesn't like apples and Twilight never learned to read. And she's just like, what if I don't like cupcakes? As if that is a defining feature of her personality, which is just something at least. And the scene towards the end where Limestone teaches Pinky about inner beauty is okay. I mean, it's not the best in the world, but it's acceptable, I guess. And on the whole, it's not that this episode is particularly bad per se. However, I feel like a lot of it is dependent on this double standard where Pinky thinks Maud is funny and full of life, but completely detests Mudbriar to the point where she can barely hold a conversation with him, despite the fact that the two of them appear similar, at least on the surface. And the fact that I don't really find that funny leads a lot of the humor here to fall flat. And because of that, this episode is here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I guess we're wrapping at the bottom tier at this point. And this episode isn't even the worst per se, although it can be a bit of a drag to watch at points. But here we have Road to Friendship. And this episode does suffer from similar issues to that of The End and Friend, where a lot of it does seem to be Starlight and Trixie bickering and them just getting on each other's nerves over and over again over stuff that happens. Although at least here it is a bit more justified based on the premise. And even then, like Starlight and Trixie, I mean, they're not always the most peaceful personalities in the world. So it kind of makes sense why they would get frustrated. despite them trying to keep it all positive on the surface. So there's that at least. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of the whole side plot of like Trixie potentially getting a ride, only for that to later be a part of their downfall. I mean, the scene where they're trying to impress the guy and showing how good friends they are, only for them to just be cringe, and the guy saying that, like they aren't really that good friends, but okay, I guess. Just it's just kind of weird in my personal opinion. Although, to this episode's credit, again, a lot of that is supposed to be a bit on the more intentional side. Plus, there's a song, which it is a pretty good song at the end of the day. I like the part in the middle where we see the male ponies having their fight in the background, but then them hearing the song and them making up, and then the fact that they reference the song later on as a big reason why they made up was at least something, at least. So there's that to consider. And at the end of the day, it is a Starlight episode, and I do like Starlight, so there's going to be some entertainment there, particularly with her friendship with Trixie. But this episode still suffers from not being too light. I mean, while it does have some good moments here and there, I feel like a lot of it is the two of them bickering and them really having their friendship tested for a lot of it, with not too much positivity going around. So there is that to consider. But at the end of the day, there are still enough moments there that I can't have it too low. Plus, a lot of that bickering is intentional and part of the story, and it's a bit more justifiable than other episodes that have similar issues. So because of that, this episode is here number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we are finally in the middle tier. And this episode is probably the least enjoyable of this grouping, but even so, it does have some mild amusement, for me at least. And here we have Granny's Gone Wild. And for the most part, this is a largely generic story of Rainbow Dash learning that just because Granny Smith and her friends are old doesn't mean that they aren't here to party. And in turn, they learn that Applejack shouldn't be babying them so much. And there are some gags here that I enjoy. I like some of the gags while they're running around Las Pegasus. I like the gag of Applejack keep showing up in Rainbow Dash's mind as she's warning her about all the stuff that the real Applejack said at the beginning. I find that at least somewhat amusing. And in general, this is an okay episode. Now, where I fault the episode a bit is that they never explain why the roller coaster is shutting down, especially when it seems to be so popular. And that seems to be the main driver of the conflict of the story, to where had it not been closing down, there probably wouldn't be much of a rush for Rainbow Dash to ride this ride. And with it being so popular and apparently being so great, there shouldn't be much of a reason for it to be closing down, unless, I mean, if it was breaking down or if they were making way for something new. And I guess they tried to avoid that so they wouldn't have the issue of the story shifting to them trying to save the roller coaster. But even so, I mean, the fact that they don't even give an explanation for why the roller coaster is shutting down is a bit of a knock. I mean, maybe they could have shut it down and they just miss it, but then they install a new ride or something that's even cooler or something. I mean, I feel like that would have at least been a more satisfying explanation than none at all. So that is a knock that I give the episode. But aside from that, the episode is just kind of okay, and I don't really have too much more to say beyond that. So because of that, is here number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we have a slightly similar episode, though there is a bit more going on. And here we have Friendship University, aka the other Flim and Flam episode. And for the most part, this episode is fine. Now, I do like some stuff within it, like the whole scheme of Flim and Flam blackmailing Twilight when she tries to break in to their office. I like Rarity dressing up as Planety and her trying to come off as this cool radical pony, so there's that to consider. And I do like the concept of Flim and Flam creating this competitor to Twilight's Friendship School, and through that they have a very different business model. Granted, one that is very self-centered and self-interested, but still one that isn't actually that bad at the end of the day. Now, I do think the episode does suffer from Twilight getting a bit on her high horse with them shutting down the Friendship University and exposing Flim and Flam to where they shut down the whole operation just because they dared to make some money off of like helping ponies learn about friendship. So I think that's a bit of a knock. I mean, I think that was a bit unnecessary considering, I mean, Flim and Flam aren't connected to royalty and they don't really have much ability to build their own business. They don't have just a castle or a building lying around where they can start their own business. So I think the episode kind of overlooks that. And I feel like it was a bit unnecessary with them focusing so much on them trying to just make some money to keep their business up and running when they were at least providing a service to ponies that live far away from Ponyville. And by them running away and shutting down, they're basically forcing all those ponies that live in Las Vegas to move far away to attend Twilight School. And I feel like in turn, it's actually a bit self-serving to Twilight. So I feel like that's not particularly great at the end of the day. However, the main reason this episode is this high is that at least the story itself is interesting. While I don't like the conclusion, I do like how a lot of the episode does have them questioning whether Flim and Flem have really changed, given the fact that they are at least teaching the right stuff, even if they are charging money and maybe not using the best practices. They are at least teaching the right stuff when it comes to friendship. So I find that element a bit interesting. Plus, there's some funny gags here and there that do bring this episode up a bit for me, despite its problems. So because of that, I do have this episode here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12. And this was an episode that I kind of enjoyed. However, I feel like there are still some issues with it. And here we have Surf and/or Turf. And this episode is interesting because there is one element of it that I really like, and that is Scootaloo's reason for liking Sequestria so much, where she talks about how being in the water makes her feel like she's flying. And if you've seen some of my previous videos, you should probably know by now why I find that element to be pretty interesting. And in general, we see both Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle giving these different reasons for why they prefer Mount Eris versus Sequestria. However, the rest of the episode outside of that is pretty okay. I mean, in general, as I talked about in the CMC video, I found that the resolution to the conflict was very obvious from early on. I mean, they never give a super clear reason why Terramar can't just go back and forth, and why him thinking that he needs to pick one is necessarily optimal over the other. Now, I kind of get it in the sense that he doesn't want to disappoint the parent that he leaves behind, and also the fact that he probably has this identity issue between being a hippogriff versus being a sea pony. But then again, I mean, hippogriffs kind of already go back and forth, especially now that the movie has happened and they can now go back and forth again. So in general, I was never too compelled by that conflict. Also, I still find it weird how Twilight is basically accepted pretty unconditionally within the Hippogriff Society, despite the fact that she stole the pearl, or attempted to steal the pearl during the movie, and the fact that they forgive her so easily, even though she did that, is a little weird. I mean, although it is kind of funny how she tries to pretend like all this is for research, when in reality she just wants to have fun and really just indulge in all the cultural stuff that they're doing. So at least there's that. But aside from that, you also have Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle's conflict boiling over until they declare themselves no longer friends, which was a bit forced. I mean, yeah, I kind of understand their different reasoning for wanting to have the different areas, but it was a bit much for them to literally break out their friendship over it. So there's that. And in general, this episode is okay, but definitely has those issues that definitely aren't explained super well. Like I said, the conflict has a very obvious solution, and it goes so far as to have them break out their friendship, which was a bit unnecessary. But there are still elements of the episode that I enjoy, namely Scootaloo's reasoning for wanting to go to Sequestria, as well as Twilight's whole situation that does make me enjoy this episode a bit, but I can't really have it higher than number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we kind of have a similar episode, although I feel like I get a bit more enjoyment out of this episode. But here we have Horseplay, and if you know me from my previous videos, you should probably know that I am never a huge fan of miscommunication, and how fitting is it that I have to complain about an episode whose entire plot revolves around miscommunication, and Twilight having to learn once again that honesty is the best policy. And really, not just Twilight, but really the rest of the main six, but, you know, like, it is what it is. Now, mind you, this episode is a bit more self-aware of that issue, in the sense that Applejack is reminding Twilight about how they need to be honest and how it is repeatedly blown up in their face, and yet Twilight continues to lie about Celestia being a good actress when in reality she is quite terrible. And it's your predictable story where like Twilight lies, like Celestia thinks she's a good actress, then it eventually boils over when things go wrong. Twilight lets it out. Celestia overhears it. She gets mad, goes off. They go off, and then Twilight learns a valuable lesson about honesty. Again, very predictable stuff and not too great at the end of the day. However, there are a couple things that are elevating this episode for me, namely its enjoyment. I mean, seeing Celestia just being so bad at acting gives us a number of funny moments, like when she is trying to say the line, "It is time for a new day in Equestria," just failing to deliver the line over and over again. Her screwing up the dance routine and breaking the set in the process. Her trying to get acting lessons and goes so poorly that she can't even play charades. All while Celestia feels like she's getting better, while Twilight and Spike know that she's doing pretty bad. In general, Twilight's whole ego about her writing the play and her thinking that she's written this masterpiece where she's like, even I can't believe how good my play is. So I got some humor out of that. And in general, it's interesting seeing each of the main six, including Starlight, have different contributions. You also have the Creature Six having their contributions, with them being the actors. And I found it pretty fitting how Fluttershy eventually got to take over the role of Celestia and really showing how far she's come along with her character development, sort of a callback to Philly Vanilli when she said that she was taking baby steps. And now we see that come to fruition where she's willing to play the lead role in a play. So in general, there are still quite a few things to enjoy about this episode. And in general, I find it to be pretty funny. It's just that at its core, it is your traditional honesty is the best policy, don't lie, lying will just make things worse story that makes me want to not hold this episode in super high regard, but it's the entertainment factor of this episode that leaves it here to be at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we kind of have a similar episode to Horseplay. Now, admittedly, there are more mean-spirited things going on in this episode. However, on the whole, I do find it a bit more well-rounded. And here we have the Mean Six. Now, it's not as if this episode is airtight per se. I mean, the fact that the main six never find out about the clones and that in general, they never find out about Chrysalis's whole plot, and the fact that they walk away from this believing that they were genuinely being mean to each other isn't the best thing in the world. Now, granted, I don't think them showing the scene of them figuring out would have been too great either. However, it still left me walking away from this episode feeling, I don't know, a bit underwhelmed per se. And in general, this episode does suffer from being a bit mean-spirited. Well, maybe not mean-spirited is the correct word, but more so a bit dour in its estimation, where the main six really walk away from this episode feeling like this was a pretty terrible experience, and they don't really learn much from it. They feel like in general this was a pretty bad experience. Now, they do try to put a positive spin on it. However, it's still not the best feeling to be walking away from in terms of this episode. Now, there are some interesting interactions that happen here, like when Twilight approaches Mean Pinky, and then Mean Pinky is showing her a bubble popping, and then she's being rude there. You also have the real Pinky trying to talk with the mean Twilight, and then her just getting annoyed by the real Pinky's storytelling. And then they run across the real Fluttershy crying after being yelled at, and then Pinky's trying to make her feel better. And then mean Twilight is like, well, tell her to get over it. Then walks away, and then the real Twilight shows up, and then Pinky really chews out the real Twilight, thinking that she was the one behind it all. And then Twilight gets emotional and is like, wow, well, if my friends feel that way, then maybe they should have stayed home. And, again, it is still a bit mean-spirited. However, it was at least something at least. You also have Starlight, who feels pretty underappreciated with mean Applejack telling her that she only had to wear all that stuff and carry all the supplies to make her look ridiculous. So there's also that. So at the end of the day, I feel like I have a pretty mixed relationship with this episode, where on one hand, it does feel a bit mean-spirited at times, and I feel like the episode doesn't really do much to really rectify it by the end of it. But on the other hand, I do feel like it also leads to some pretty interesting moments and some semi-funny moments, not to mention Evil Twilight's plan to overrule rule Chrysalis and to really abdicate her position there, and through that really develop her own plans of power. You also have the death scenes of the mean counterparts, which was semi interesting. And in general, Chrysalis was pretty funny in the episode, even if she wasn't that big of a threat. So, like I said, even that element of it is a big mix for me. However, I feel like it comes out to it being around this spot on the list, which again is roughly in the middle of the list and a bit above average. But at the end of the day, it's still an episode that I'm not the most excited about either. So because of that, I do have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we're kind of wrapping up this grouping of episodes that I think are semi-interesting, but still kind of flawed. And actually, this episode is the one that I have the most enjoyment watching out of the ones we just talked about, though it is certainly with its issues. But here we have the Washouts. And I know there are people who feel like this one should be a bit lower on the list, and for good reason. I think the biggest missed opportunity is for Lightning Dust to have a satisfying send-off. Now, I don't necessarily think she should have gotten a redemption arc per se. However, it felt like once Rainbow Dash really got on her bad side, that it pretty much made her this comic cartoon villain per se. And I don't like how at the end she just kind of gets sent off into space and she's like, "You will rue this day, Rainbow Dash," sort of like Team Rocket being sent off into space. So not necessarily the best send off for Lightning Dust, although considering her role in the episode, I kind of get it per se. But if we're looking aside from that, this is actually a pretty enjoyable episode, with Scootaloo getting increasingly upset with the idea that Rainbow doesn't value her and that the only way Rainbow will see her as a success is if she ends up joining the Wonderbolts. But according to her definition of what makes some pony great, she's got bad news. She'll never be the best of the best or Wonderbolt because she can't fly. And in general, that does lead to a pretty interesting conflict here. Admittedly, I wish it had taken up more of the episode per se, although we definitely see from earlier on in the episode just how uninterested Scootaloo is, and how every time Rainbow Dash brings up the fact that she wants Scootaloo to eventually become a Wonderbolt, Scootaloo is just very not pleased with the prospect of that. And in general, we see Rainbow try to get Scootaloo back on the good side per se by taking out her Spitfire, and that whole scene is pretty funny. You also have her trying to point out all the dangers with Scootaloo joining the Washouts. And even at the end, when we see Rainbow Dash creating the Scootaloo fan club, I mean, yeah, that's pretty heartwarming and stuff. However, I feel like they could have done a bit more to address the fact that Scootaloo can't actually fly. And considering all the contraptions that exist in the world, like the fact that Rainbow has this flying propeller machine to have Tank fly around in, I mean, I guess that sort of raises the question of why Scootaloo can't have something like that around so that she can still fly, even though her wings can't work. So I still feel like they could have done more to actually address the issue rather than just bring it up, but still an interesting through line in which to interpret a lot of this conflict here of Scootaloo wanting to see the Washouts as his channel to express her like thrill-seeking nature and her wanting to be a Wonderbolt but simply not being able to. So in general, this is an episode I do enjoy a lot, and considering I am a big fan of Scootaloo and a lot of her conflict concerning her disability, this was naturally an episode that I gravitated towards a bit. However, I still feel like there were enough missed opportunities there and just opportunities in which they could have expanded upon that story more than they did, but simply didn't. So because of that, I do have to leave this episode here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and I kind of can't believe this episode is this high in the list, considering how lowly I've talked about in the past. However, considering the rest of the field here, it kind of has to land here. But at number 8, we do have the Season 8 premiere, and that is School Daze. Now, again, I've talked about School Daze before, how I've never been that impressed by it, and in general, it is the least impressive two-parter from a pure stakes standpoint. It feels very much like a regular episode, with it trying so hard to establish the Creature 6 and the school and everything like that. Now, there are some interesting elements like Naysay coming in with his racist ideology, him thinking that friendship is simply a tool to be used for Equestria's sake to fend off against foreign threats, which, if you consider all the two parts that came before that, actually isn't the worst idea in the world. And in general, I do appreciate the show's effort to address some of the world building issues that it had across some of the previous seasons here. But at the end of the day, this episode still feels largely boring. I mean, a lot of it, again, focuses on the Creature Six meeting each other, getting to know each other, getting past a lot of the stereotypes with each other's races, per se, and then eventually forming this group for themselves. So there's that, per se. However, at the end of the day, this is still not the most compelling two-parter, per se. But if we are comparing it to the rest of season 8, it is a relatively sound episode. Like, there aren't too many blatant plot holes with it. I mean, I guess aside from the leaders threatening to wage war during a lot of part 2, and Twilight just being able to get around the EEA's approval with seemingly no consequences. Like, Celestia brings up the fact that she needs to get EEA approval in order to, like, ensure that there is some sense of rule of law in the land, that even a princess has to abide by regulations. But at the end, Celestia just decides to completely disregard that simply because friendship is a different field of study that deserves to be taught in a different way than other fields, which is like, okay. But still, it's like, kind of defeats the point of the EEA at that point. So again, there are still plenty of issues with this episode. I'm not saying this is some flawless episode per se, but if we are looking at the episodes that came before it, I do have less issues with it. And a lot of it just stems from it being a bit boring, especially for a two-parter. But I feel like 8 is probably the spot where it belongs on this list. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have a somewhat similar episode to the Washouts in the sense that it has some good ideas and has somewhat effective execution, but definitely leaves some room for improvement there. However, I feel like this episode is still more enjoyable than School Daze. However, at number 7, we do have the parent map. And in general, I do like this episode quite a lot. Now, again, it isn't without its issues. I mean, it does have a very obvious conflict here, with the conflict very obviously being between Starlight and Sunburst, and the fact that it takes so long for them to pick up on it isn't ideal. However, I feel like the issues with this episode aren't as blatant as it is with, say, the Washouts, and even compared to School Daze, which again does suffer from Celestia throwing out the EEA's regulations when it comes to Twilight School. However, this episode does still have plenty of pros, like for one, the way in which their town has changed over the years to where it's become this town of conflicting philosophies, where Firefly wants to keep everything exactly the same, while Stellar Flare is trying to gentrify the town. So there's that issue going on. And in general, you have the drama between Starlight and Sunburst and their respective parents here. Now, I do think there are some missed opportunities with some of those relationships, like the fact that Starlight and Firefly don't talk more about like what happened in their childhood. I mean, the fact that Starlight went on the path that she did because she lost her only friend, and the fact that Firefly was unable to stop that trajectory from happening is a storyline that could have been explored upon more. Now, it is implied that he does know what Starlight ended up doing, but still, the fact that it's not really explained where he fit into that, per se. I mean, all we get is that quick gag of, you know, like seeing Starlight's room from when she was a teenager and just seeing how she's become this goth pony and how this situation basically destroyed her sense of self-worth to the point where she was embracing that type of decor, per se. So, I mean, but aside from that, I mean, we don't really get any other glimpse into how Firefly attempted to make Starlight feel happy with her life, to try to get her to make other friends, and in general to prevent her from going off and becoming a villain. And then we see Sunburst side of things, where we see Stellar Flare talking about how she doesn't want him to be let down the same way that he flunked out of magic school. Now, granted, that storyline isn't as interesting. However, it's still interesting to see Stellar Flare being this control freak in general. So there is still something to be chewed at there. So there is plenty of merit there given the premise of this episode. But like Washouts, I kind of wish that they went a bit further in certain directions, particularly with Fireflight's role in Starlight's childhood and how he tried to keep Starlight from going in the path that she did. However, I can't fault the episode too much compared to the episodes we already talked about, and it was at least more entertaining to watch than School Daze. So because of that, I do have this episode here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we are wrapping up the two-parters here. And here we have School Raze, the season finale. And I do think School Raze is the superior two-parter of season 8 here, in that it does have a bit more going on. We get a glimpse into Cozy Glow's view of friendship, which is very utilitarian based. The fact that she can use it in order to build allies and in turn consolidate power, which is a very practical way of using friendship there, and really in a way that is similar to how Daze views friendship, and that is strictly a weapon to be used to defend against threats. And we see here that Cozy Glow is using it in this more tactical way, only this time she's going on the offense versus on the defense, and in turn gets Daze to see the flaws in his worldview, so that by the end he does sort of come around to seeing friendship as a more inherent good than just something to be used as a tool. So there's that at least going on, and plus Cozy Glow is pretty entertaining. Now I do think a lot of the stuff that happens in Tartarus is a bit boring in my view, where the main 6 are stuck there for a lot of the episode, and a lot of it is them just trying to get out. Not the most exciting stuff in the world, but not the worst stuff in the world anyway either. There's also the huge question of why Cozy Glow isn't reformed, why she isn't even given a backstory. And I heard some people say that was supposed to be written as an adult, that with a child's mentality and a child's appearance. However, the fact that that's never really explained in the show leads me to assume that she is a child, and therefore there's a huge issue of Twilight choosing to punish a child for a arguably lesser crime than Starlight did for almost ending the world in an arguably more dangerous way than what Cozy Glow was able to execute here. So there's that double standard going on, although I have explained that in the past, how a lot of it was seeming to be the writers reacting to the perception that the show was about nothing but them redeeming all these villains. So they wanted to just have a villain that was just purely evil to demonstrate that they understood nuance when it comes to evil characters. But, I can take that or leave it. In general, there are a couple interesting moments with the two-parter. Now, I can't have it ranked too highly among the two-parters. However, there is enough going on there to where I can give it some credit, and in general, it is a pretty good episode in the grand scheme of Season 8. However, I feel like the top 5 episodes do have a bit more to offer for me, at least, and they are a bit more interesting in their own right. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I feel like this is probably the top tier of this season, as I feel like all 5 of these episodes are pretty solid in their own right. It's just a matter of the order. But at number 5, we have a pretty interesting episode to discuss here, and we actually have Marks for Effort, Cozy Glow's introduction episode, and this is a pretty solid episode on the whole. Now, it is interesting seeing the CMC really interact here, seeing them trying to get into the School of Friendship, despite them already knowing everything that there is to know about friendship. It's pretty funny seeing all their attempts to prove that they aren't as good a friendship as they appear, with Apple Bloom saying that she wants to learn about friendship, only for Applejack to force her to do some chores. You also have their whole fight, or them attempting to put on a fight, but them getting so caught up in how much it's working that they end up dropping the script and end up hugging it out, and then proving to Fluttershy and Pinkie that they are good friends after all. And the fact that Fluttershy and Pinkie even believed them, despite how awful their acting was another funny element to it as well. You have Cozy Glow's introduction, which, again, I talked about this before. I mean, I was never particularly that fooled by her. I mean, she always came off as a twist villain, and that really came off here between how obvious her Wabbit accent is, and how manufactured it is, how her normal voice doesn't sound too much like that, how she only says that when she gets pretty emotional and wants people to feel bad for her. You also have that image of her studying with the flashcards and the Twilight's cutie mark appearing in her irises there. I find that interesting as well. Her entire scheme of failing the test on purpose in order to make it seem like the CMC didn't know much about friendship, even though we see it getting them in trouble by having Twilight call them into their office. How they knew they wanted to be invited inside, but it wasn't how it went in their head. So there's that. And in general, Cozy Glow very much gave off this vibe of her eventually becoming a villain, which obviously was eventually confirmed. And the CMC getting to be these honorary graduates of the school was a pretty satisfying conclusion. There are some pretty other funny moments as well, like the whole scene at Starlight's office, her wondering what the point of a guidance counselor is in a school on friendship, only for Cozy Glow to come in, seeing all of Starlight's attempts at being a good guidance counselor when she finally gets one student was also pretty funny as well. So in general, this was a pretty solid episode. I don't really have too many complaints to say about it. And in general, it was a very entertaining episode to watch. And yes, while Cozy Glow's villainy wasn't hidden super well, I still enjoy seeing her arc throughout the episode, and it's enough to land it here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have an episode that I have talked about before, but I'm talking about it here again. But here we have Molt down. And to me, this is definitely one of the better Spike episodes in the series, in that a lot of it focuses on him, well, growing up. Now, admittedly, I do think that parts of the episode are slow at points. However, I feel like this episode has a lot going for it. I mean, for one, it has his relationship with Smolder, and Smolder really being this positive role model for him at this point, to the point where like she's helping him like navigate this whole phase of him molting and eventually growing his wings. So I do find that really endearing. And then also his situation later on the episode when he's trying to keep Rarity safe, but in turn he eventually turns into a statue. Like, and I always like that shot of him just being completely covered in molt, and then literally a couple seconds of silence as it does his slow pan outward of him being frozen until he eventually cracks out of his cocoon with his new wings. So I do find that moment to be pretty interesting. And then on the whole, this is just a very enjoyable episode for me. I definitely feel like this is one of the stronger episodes to come out of season 8. And I have talked about before in my Spike episode ranking. So I do feel like this is a very solid episode. However, I do feel like the top 3 top it to a certain degree. I do find more enjoyment out of those top 3. So I do have to leave it here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have a pretty notable episode to get into here. Definitely one of the more memorable ones for me. And here we have Sounds of Silence, which for whatever reason, I always confuse with the Kieran Tale. I always feel like a Kieran Tale should be the name of the episode, but it's just the name of the song. And this is a very strong episode for me for pretty obvious reasons. It tells a pretty interesting story of Fluttershy and Applejack coming to this village of Kieran, who like have been so afraid to be angry at each other that they literally cast a spell on each other to avoid speaking at all. And I always found the combination of Fluttershy and Applejack pretty interesting here, where obviously Applejack is all about honesty and like letting it all out, while Fluttershy is a bit more sensitive and a bit more willing to like hedge her bets in order to avoid making people upset. So it is a pretty interesting combination that they go for here. Now, one of the few knocks I have against this episode is that it actually takes a pretty long time for them to actually get to the Kieran village, and by the time they sing the song, it feels like the episode is almost over. So I do feel like this episode suffers from a bit of a pacing issue, but the actual parts that are in the village is very interesting. We see Applejack going out of the village and running into Autumn Blaze, who is a very interesting character for me. She has a very catchy song where she explains the entire history of the Kieran, as well as why she is not living in the village. But at the same time, you actually feel bad for her because she's so lonely that she has literally painted faces on all these inanimate objects and really using them to build a connection. So there's that. We have Applejack going back to the village only for Fluttershy to give the Kieran side of the story, which again is another knock to a degree in the sense that we don't get enough of Fluttershy discovering the truth behind the Kieran and their point of view. A lot of it does seem to focus on Applejack here. And the overall message is very interesting, where it does teach that, like, you can't be afraid to get angry at each other to express how you truly feel and what is really going on, which is a pretty powerful message. I mean, I know it's a pretty standard honesty is the best policy message, but again, the way it's executed here is very effective and very interesting. So I do give this episode a lot of credit for that. And on the whole, this episode is pretty entertaining to watch. Now, again, it's not without its flaws. I do think the pacing is still a bit of an issue. And again, while the message itself is very interestingly executed, it's still not super unique at the end of the day. There are, again, plenty of other episodes that have done an honesty message before, but it's through the lens of it being afraid to upset others that does make it a bit more unique. And then the song, as I said, is what really makes this episode stand out in a lot of ways. So this is definitely one of the stronger episodes to come out of season 8 and definitely a top contender for me. But I feel like the top two are pretty interesting on their own as well. That does lead this episode out of the top two. So I do have to leave it here at number 3. Now I'm moving on to number 2. And for me, this is the pretty clear top 2. And it's really just a matter of the order. And believe it or not, both of them focus a lot on the Creature 6. And admittedly, I kind of regret not making a Creature 6 episode ranking before delving into this. However, I feel like now is a pretty good opportunity to get into some of these episodes. But number 2, we have the Hearthswarming Club. And I did technically talk about this episode, my holiday episode ranking, so it kind of equals out in that regard. But again, this is a very strong episode where a lot of it does seem to focus around the Creature 6 and then talking about their various traditions around the holidays. I do love how a lot of the episode is them just in this room while they're awaiting their fate, and one of them is being pulled out at a time to be asked questions about like the vandalism thing. However, we do get a glimpse into each of their stories, and I do like how each of their stories are presented with their own unique perspective. I love Sambar's segment where he basically had a life that's so boring that his most dramatic event is his heartwarming doll almost falling into the fire. But even then, it just fell next to the fire in a spot where it didn't really have the position to fall into the fire itself. But the fact that his life is so boring that that's the best story you can tell really highlights just how interesting the other cultures are in relation to a pony-centric world. So there's that. And then we get the reveal towards the end that Gallus was the one behind it all. Now, admittedly, I feel like the episode does a pretty good job at hiding Gallus's guilt for a lot of it, where the main foreshadowing comes when he's the first one to be interviewed, and then he said, "I didn't do it," which was pretty interesting coming into it. Now, we get to him like seeing the rest of the Creature 6 arguing when it seems pretty clear that none of them are fessing up, to the point where it seems like none of them are going to be able to go home. And we see him like slowly like getting them to stop by saying, "Guys, just cut it out." But then the arguing just continues until he eventually yells at them to stop. And then that's when he reveals the story that he doesn't really have many happy traditions, that the Griffins are still a largely broken society that don't really foster friendship or family to the degree that the other cultures do. And it's to the point where he doesn't even have a family of his own. And that's why he committed this crime so that he can spend the holidays with them. And I find that reveal to be pretty interesting, and it was pretty well executed as well. And then Twilight and Rainbow Dash come out and say that they knew that Gallus did the whole time, but they just wanted to wait for the opportunity for Gallus to open up himself in order to relieve the suspense per se. And then we have the rest of the Creature 6 agreeing to spend the holidays with Gallus so he won't be alone, which is pretty endearing, all things considered. So this is a very strong episode. I mean, it's pretty good world building. It's a good way to establish the bonds with each of the Creature 6 and really reinforcing what a lot of these later seasons are trying to do and fostering these multicultural relationships, which is very interesting. And of course, there's Gallus's whole involvement here, which really elevates the episode for me. And on the whole, this is a largely endearing episode for me. However, I do feel like there's one episode that tops it for me, so I do have to leave it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best episode of Season 8 for me is, as I said, a Creature 6 episode, but one that really does an effective job at feeling like a two-parter while being a regular 22-minute episode. But here we have What Lies Beneath. And I love this episode. I mean, it's a pretty engaging one from start to finish, as it really does a great job at combining like this grander story with a lot of the character stuff that you might expect with two-parters really being condensed down to 22 minutes. And I feel like it paces itself pretty effectively in that regard. Where obviously early on we see the Creature Six studying for this friendship test, but along the way we have Cozy Glow basically driving a wedge in their friendship by engaging on all these microaggressions and playing into all these stereotypes of these creatures that we kind of know over the series, like how changelings are starving for love, how hippogriffs are hiding underwater, like, and are pretty sheltered and can't trust anyone. How griffins never want to be around anyone, not even other griffins. Dragons being pretty fierce and how they don't want to do anything with ponies either, and how yaks are too proud to associate with anyone. Basically being pretty racist at the end of the day, but just seeing how the Creature Six basically buy into everything she's saying to the point where they feel pretty discouraged about studying for this test and for even being friends with each other. And I find that to be pretty interesting. Now, granted, I already had a very strong feeling at the time of watching this that Cozy Glow was going to be a villain, as I talked about when discussing Marks for Effort. So it was pretty evident by this point as well that this was part of her plan to undercut everything going on. And then we get to the Creature Six discovering this test, and we see them having to face their fears. And each of their fears are pretty interesting for the most part, with Gals being in a tight space and having claustrophobia, with Silverstream having to face the Storm King, with Ocellus finding changelings in her old form and having to deal with the fact that she is as evil as Queen Chrysalis. I mean, all this stuff that's now, granted, some of them are more effective than others, like, again, Silverstream's fear of the Storm King, as well as Ocellus feeling like she's evil just because she's a changeling. But it all makes it all the more effective when we see each of them confronting their fears. I mean, slowly but surely, they come to accept the fact that they should be friends, how a big part of them conquering their fear is just getting over it and really encouraging each other. And I always love each of the scenes where they finally get over that hump. I love the moment where Silverstream is giving this rant to the Storm King, basically telling him off, only for it to fall away the moment that she's able to stand up to it. I mean, really indicating that this is a test. And then at the end, the six of them are able to come together. And despite what Cozy Glow said, they realize that they have what it takes to be friends with each other. And I always love the quote at the end where they are a bit too tired and they fall asleep. And then when they say something about the actual test, we have Ocellus saying, "We're gonna fail." So on the whole, this is a very effective episode that is basically able to become a two-parter within the span of 22 minutes and really delves into these interesting ideas. I mean, Cozy Glow's whole plan of basically discouraging the Creature Six through microaggressions and being pretty racist to non-pony characters was pretty interesting. And then each of the tests that the Creature Six faced and having to face their fears. And again, some of them aren't as interesting as others, but I feel like the ones that are really effective are very, very interesting to watch. And I feel like compared to all the other episodes in season 8, this one is clearly the best for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now we only have one season left to cover, that being season 9, before we get into the all-time episode ranking, which should be very, very time consuming to put together, but that's just what it is. So stay tuned for that. I obviously have other videos coming out soon covering other shows that I like and other shows that I've covered on this channel before, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, and I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.